Elvis Presley, the undisputed king of rock and roll, had conquered the world with his voice, his moves, and his charisma. But fame had never erased the shadows of his past. On the streets of Memphis, decades after those years of teasing and cruelty, he spotted a man whose face jolted memories he thought he had buried. It was the boy who once mocked him in school. The same hands that had torn at his confidence now shaking, trembling, worn down by life's relentless hardships. For a heartbeat, Elvis could have walked past, could have let history lie in silence, but something inside him stirred. The air between them seemed charged, electric, heavy with anticipation, as if the city itself held its breath. No one knew what would unfold next. Revenge, confrontation, or something far more extraordinary. And then, in a moment that defied every expectation, Elvis did something the world had never seen before. What happened next would challenge everything anyone thought they knew about power, forgiveness, and the true strength of a legend. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The dusty streets of Tupelo in the early 1940s were a patchwork of clay, gravel, and the occasional crack where weeds had taken hold. Sunlight poured through the narrow gaps between wooden houses, highlighting the uneven boards and the peeling paint that spoke of years of weather and wear. A small boy, no older than 10, scuffed along the sidewalk, his trousers frayed at the knees, his shoes patched with old leather that barely held together. His name was Elvis Presley, and he carried with him a fragile, trembling hope, a spark of music that seemed to flicker stubbornly in the corners of his wide, expressive eyes. Elvis had always been different. Even among the lively chatter of children at school, he seemed to move to another rhythm, humming melodies under his breath, fingers tapping in invisible percussion. At first, the other boys and girls didn't notice much, but as soon as he opened his mouth to sing, the world shifted. Not in a way that invited admiration, but in a way that invited ridicule. It was during music class, in the small, dusty schoolroom with its cracked blackboards and wooden desks scratched with the memories of generations past, that the torment began in earnest. "Sound like a frog, Presley," sneered the largest boy in the class, a broad-shouldered boy named Tommy Harlan, who had made it his mission to remind Elvis of every inch of difference between them. "You think you're gonna be anyone with that squeaky voice? You're a joke." Tommy's words sliced through the quiet, and a few other boys snickered behind their hands. One by one, they tore at the pages of his songbook, sending notes fluttering like wounded birds across the floor. Elvis's stomach knotted. His lips trembled, not with fear, but with a strange defiance he didn't yet fully understand. At recess, he would retreat to the narrow path behind the school, where the tall grass brushed against his knees, and the wind carried a faint hint of the cotton fields beyond. Here he could sing freely, without ridicule, and the notes seemed to rise above the dusty streets of Tupelo, weaving themselves into the sky, as if the clouds themselves were listening. He dreamed of stages bigger than his backyard, lights brighter than the afternoon sun, and crowds cheering for his voice. A world far removed from these wooden walls and cruel laughter. Home was a different kind of refuge. The small house, painted in a pale, tired shade of blue, smelled of cornbread and the faint tang of tobacco smoke from his father's corner chair. His mother, Gladys, often sat on the worn sofa, hand stroking the small guitar that rested across his knees. "Sing, Elvis," she would whisper gently. "Sing like your heart belongs to the world." And he did. Every note that left his lips in that modest living room was a rebellion against the shame he carried from school, a quiet promise to himself that one day the world would hear him on his own terms. Yet even in these moments of solace, the memory of Tommy's laughter lingered. He remembered the sharp tilt of his former classmates' sneer, the rough slap on his notebook, the way the other children had cowered or joined in out of fear or mimicry. Those memories, bitter as raw sugar, pressed into his young heart, shaping the boy who would grow into a man capable of both immense vulnerability and breathtaking resilience. He knew early on that the world could be cruel, that admiration might come only after enduring mockery, and that music was both a shield and a sword. Even on the nights when Tupelo's air was thick with humidity and the crickets sang in chorus outside his window, Elvis would lie awake, guitar in hand, and trace the strings with his fingers. Each note was a defiance, each chord a small victory over the humiliation of childhood. In the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, he imagined himself on a stage, the audience rising as one, the notes of his voice filling a hall so large it dwarfed even his grandest dreams. And in that imagined world, he was free. By the time he drifted off to sleep, the small boy in patched pants had begun to understand something fundamental: that pain could be transformed into music, that ridicule could be transformed into strength, and that every moment of loneliness, every cruel word, was a note in the song he would one day perform for the world. Even as Tupelo faded into the shadows of the night, the melody inside him grew louder, a stubborn, bright pulse that refused to be dimmed. And so the boy who had walked the dusty streets of Tupelo, who had felt the sting of mockery and the weight of shame, held on to his dreams with a grip that would never falter. This was the first lesson that would follow him to every stage, every city, every heart he would touch, that even the smallest, most overlooked voice could one day command the attention of millions. In that moment, in that quiet resilience, the seed of a legend was planted, fragile but unyielding, ready to grow into a force the world could not ignore. By the early 1960s, the name Elvis Presley no longer belonged solely to a boy from Tupelo. It belonged to an era, a sound, a phenomenon that swept across the country like wildfire. From the gleaming streets of Los Angeles to the neon-lit boulevards of Las Vegas, the world seemed to revolve around him. Cadillac after Cadillac rolled past in parade-like processions, fans shrieking in unison as if drawn by some magnetic force, voices cracking in their desperate attempts to be heard over the roar of his music. Cameras clicked incessantly, capturing moments of a life that had become myth before the man inside had fully understood what it meant to live it. Backstage at a sold-out concert in Las Vegas, the air heavy with the scent of perfume, sweat, and the faint metallic tang of electric instruments, Elvis paused for a moment, adjusting the rhinestones on his jacket. His eyes, dark and searching, reflected something deeper than the glittering lights, something the fans never saw. He could hear them screaming for the hits, for the gyrations, for the energy that had defined his rise. But behind the music, behind the spectacle, memories clawed at him. The memory of that small boy in frayed pants and torn shoes, humbly standing in a schoolroom as the laughter of his classmates erupted around him, was still vivid. It had been decades, yet the sting of those moments persisted in his chest, subtle and persistent, like a dull ache that never fully faded. At that moment, Elvis was surrounded by luxury and adoration, yet the boy who had been bullied, mocked, and dismissed was still there, alive beneath the surface of the king persona. An interviewer leaned in, microphone poised, capturing the frenzy of the moment and the calm beneath it. "Elvis," the voice asked, steady but probing, "did school life influence your music in any way?" The question hung in the air like smoke. For a brief instant, Elvis's hands paused, his fingers brushing against the piano keys by his side. "Not everyone appreciated how I sang," he said quietly, a faint, wistful smile crossing his face. "But that's life, isn't it? Some people cheer, some people don't. It's not about them. It's about what you love." He didn't dwell on it, didn't let the bitterness seep into his tone. But those words were laden with more meaning than the audience could immediately grasp. A quiet triumph over every ridicule he had endured. A defiance embedded in calmness rather than anger. Between concerts, limousines, and the relentless schedule of appearances, there were still moments when the shadows of his past found him. Sometimes, alone in his suite at the hotel, he would trace the keys of the piano absent-mindedly, feeling the old ache in his chest. The echoes of laughter, the sneers, the notes that had once felt like daggers. They weren't gone. But they were no longer wounds. They had become notes in a melody, rhythms that fed the fire that burned behind every performance. And yet, not all shadows were internal. The world, adoration aside, had an undercurrent of isolation for him. Fame was a gilded cage. Every smile, every autograph, every standing ovation was a reminder of how far he had come, and how little he could be himself. The boy from Tupelo, who once ran barefoot across sun-baked streets, could not stroll unnoticed. Every public appearance was a performance, not only of music, but of control over the fragile, vulnerable self that lingered just beneath the rhinestones and velvet. Even in the chaos of his fame, there were moments that drew his mind back to schoolyards, to torn notebooks, to the sneers that once rang louder than applause could ever drown out. And in those moments, a quiet question emerged. Had he truly left that life behind? Or did it wait patiently, like a shadow at the edge of the spotlight, ready to remind him that every rise has its echo? The answer, he knew, was complicated. The past was not erased, only transformed, a contrast that made the victories sweeter and the music more poignant. It was during these reflective pauses, away from the crowd's gaze, that he understood the paradox of fame. It magnified every achievement, but it also highlighted the fragility of what had come before. Behind every glittering show, every screaming fan, was a boy who had once been invisible, who had felt every cruel laugh as a weight pressing down on his chest. Those experiences, once sources of pain, had become the foundation of his resilience. The reason his voice could carry not only melody, but emotion, connection, and authenticity. And as he strode back onto the stage night after night, the past and present converging in a dazzling swirl of lights, music, and applause, he carried the quiet awareness that every laugh he had endured as a child had led him here. The boy who had been mocked for daring to sing was now a man whose voice could silence entire arenas, whose presence could draw thousands into collective awe, whose life was a testament to endurance, forgiveness, and transformation. Yet beneath the glitz, beneath the applause, a lingering tension remained. The memory of those who had once inflicted pain. It was a silent promise to himself that one day he would confront not only the echoes of his childhood, but the people who had created them. The world knew the king of rock and roll. He knew the boy who had once trembled with every harsh word. And that knowledge, like a quiet drumbeat beneath the roar of his fame, reminded him that true greatness was not measured in adoration alone, but in the ability to rise above the cruelty that had once seemed insurmountable. The heat of the Memphis afternoon pressed down unevenly, coating the streets with a thick haze that seemed to shimmer off the asphalt. Elvis had stepped out of Graceland, a light breeze ruffling the collar of his signature jacket, his mind still lingering on the interview from earlier that morning. Cameras flashed inside the gates, but outside, the world moved at a different pace. Slower, rougher, rawer. A reminder that fame could not fully shield him from reality. He adjusted his sunglasses, his steps echoing against the uneven pavement, each footfall carrying him through the neighborhood he had once known intimately. The streets were alive with the hum of city life. Children playing with sticks that served as makeshift drumsticks, the distant call of a vendor selling roasted peanuts, a dog barking at a passerby. It was familiar, almost comforting, but beneath the ordinary, a tension lingered, as if something unexpected waited just out of view. Elvis's gaze drifted to the shop windows lining the street, reflections of a man who had become larger than life mirrored back at him. He almost missed it, the face in the crowd. But the moment his eyes locked on that worn, haggard expression, time seemed to constrict. The man had aged far beyond his years. His coat, once probably sturdy, hung in tatters, the sleeves frayed, shoulders sagging from a weight that seemed heavier than mere fabric. His face bore the harsh lines of neglect and hardship, eyes sunken yet flickering with recognition, the faintest trace of disbelief and fear. Elvis froze, the echo of a memory sharper than the afternoon sun cutting through the heat. It was him, the boy who had tormented him in the schoolyard, the bully who had made afternoons unbearable, whose cruel laughter had once echoed louder than any applause could drown out. The man caught Elvis's stare and flinched, his hands tightening against the thin straps of a worn bag slung over one shoulder. For a heartbeat, he looked like a shadow of the boy who had once strided through the classroom with arrogance, confident that power was a weapon. Now, that same figure appeared diminished, fragile, as if life itself had spent decades attempting to make amends for every act of cruelty. His eyes, once glinting with mischief and bravado, now glistened with shame and vulnerability, a stark mirror to Elvis's own memories of fear and humiliation. For a moment, Elvis considered walking past, letting the man remain another forgotten casualty of time's relentless passage. The world around them would have applauded his discretion. Fans would not have questioned the king for moving on. But something inside him, that enduring boy who had refused to let despair consume his dreams, stirred. He could not, would not, ignore this unexpected confrontation. The man's voice trembled, barely audible over the murmur of the street. "Elvis, you remember me, don't you?" It was a statement, not a question. His gaze dropped instinctively to the ground, unable to meet the unwavering eyes of the legend before him. The shame radiated from him in waves, a palpable weight that seemed to press against Elvis's chest. The street around them blurred, the sounds of Memphis fading into the background, leaving only the gravity of this reunion suspended in the summer heat. Elvis's hand twitched, a subtle gesture that betrayed the storm of emotions behind his calm exterior. Anger? Perhaps a flicker, long suppressed. Resentment? Brief, fleeting, drowned immediately by a profound awareness of life's irony. Here was the boy who had once inflicted pain, now reduced to a figure of fragility, and yet his presence stirred more than just memories. It awakened a choice, to react with old wounds, to lash back, or to do something unexpected. The man's voice broke the silence again, softer this time, imbued with regret. I never thought I'd see you like this. I don't deserve it. I don't even deserve to be looking at you." Each word seemed to tremble with the weight of decades, a confession long overdue. His eyes glistened, tears threatening, his posture shrinking as though attempting to make himself smaller, less visible. Elvis stepped forward, the motion deliberate but gentle. The distance closed, and with it, a lifetime of unspoken questions and suppressed pain. He remembered the endless nights of mockery, the torn notebooks, the whispered insults that had followed him home, but instead of fury, he felt something unexpected. The same force that had carried him through ridicule and rejection now surged within him. The power of empathy, the calm strength of one who had endured. For an instant, the world seemed to hold its breath. The hum of the city, the distant car horns, the children's laughter, all faded into a backdrop for this collision of past and present. What would he say? What would he do? A crowd began to gather without realizing, drawn by the incongruity of a man in rhinestones and a worn figure on a sun-baked street. The legend and the shadow of a boy who had once inflicted pain. The man swallowed hard, eyes brimming, voice barely audible. I... Words failed him, leaving only the weight of remorse and recognition. Elvis felt the tension in the air, the expectancy of an unseen audience, yet he moved with quiet authority. He could forgive, he could extend a hand, or he could simply walk away. The choice was his. And then, as the sun dipped slightly toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the street, Elvis made his decision. He would not let the boy from the past dictate the course of this moment. He would confront it, embrace it, transform it into something neither of them had anticipated. The street waited. The moment lingered. And in the gaze of a man who had once caused him suffering, Elvis saw a possibility, the fragile, trembling possibility of redemption. The heat of the Memphis street seemed to intensify, wrapping around them like a taut wire stretched to its limit. Elvis stood frozen for a heartbeat longer than necessary, eyes locked on the hunched figure before him. The man's trembling hands twisted the frayed edges of his coat, a subconscious attempt to protect himself, to hide from the magnitude of the moment. People had begun to notice, gathering in tentative clusters, whispering, their curiosity prickling the air like static. Yet, in that suspended reality, it felt as if the city itself had paused, giving space for what was about to unfold. Elvis took a slow, deliberate step forward. The sound of his boots against the uneven sidewalk seemed to echo louder than anything else, a rhythm that matched the hammering of his heart. He remembered every cruel word, every mocking laugh, every ounce of humiliation he had endured at the hands of this man decades ago. But anger, though present in the corners of his consciousness, had no power over him now. He carried something stronger, the clarity that comes from surviving, from rising above, and from understanding that the cycle of pain need not continue. The man lifted his eyes briefly, meeting Elvis's gaze with a mixture of fear and hope so raw it was almost unbearable. His lips trembled, words catching in his throat. I know you remember me," he said, voice breaking, thick with guilt. I shouldn't even be here. I don't deserve—" He stopped, swallowing hard, shame making his shoulders droop further, as if gravity itself had decided to punish him for the sins of his youth. Elvis, surprisingly calm, closed the distance, letting the energy between them shift. He could see the outline of his younger self reflected in the man's posture. Defensive, vulnerable, uncertain. Yet now, it was the opposite of what he had once known. Then, the boy had wielded cruelty like a weapon. Now, the man carried the weight of regret like chains that refused to break. Instead of responding with anger or judgment, Elvis extended his hand slightly, the gesture subtle, yet imbued with the unspoken power of reconciliation. "Everyone makes mistakes," he said, voice low but steady, carrying the warmth of someone who had endured and overcome. "I made my share, too. And yet, here we are. I didn't forget. but I'm not here to punish." The words hung in the air, cutting through decades of tension and suspicion, their simplicity paradoxically profound. The man's hands shook as he lowered them, tears beginning to form at the corners of his eyes. I I thought you'd hate me. I was afraid you'd want revenge, and I didn't know if I could face you." His voice cracked with the fragility of a man who had spent his life running from shadows of the past, carrying a guilt that had grown heavier each year. "I listened to your songs, sometimes in secret, when I thought no one could see. They gave me hope I didn't think I deserved." Elvis absorbed every word, feeling the echo of his own experiences mirrored back. He had known fear, he had known humiliation, and he had known despair. And yet, he had also known resilience. Standing there on that sun-baked street, he realized that the boy who had once tormented him now needed guidance more than condemnation, a chance to reclaim the life he had allowed to slip away. "Life has a way of testing us all," Elvis said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had faced his own darkness and emerged intact. "Punishment isn't always about revenge. Sometimes the hardest sentence is the one you live with yourself. But that doesn't mean you can't change, or that you don't deserve a chance to do better." The man blinked, tears spilling freely now, the remnants of pride and denial dissolving. He opened his mouth to speak again, but found only silence. His chest heaved, his body trembling as decades of fear, shame, and self-recrimination seemed to unravel in the presence of the person he had once tormented. The boy he had thought he had destroyed, now a man radiating strength, forgiveness, and unexpected kindness. Around them, the crowd had grown, whispers rising to murmurs as people recognized the king himself engaging with someone so visibly fragile, so human. There was no pomp, no spectacle, just the quiet, electrifying moment of two lives intersecting in a way that defied expectation. Elvis's hand moved to rest gently on the man's shoulder, a gesture that carried more weight than words ever could. "It's never too late," he said softly. "Not for you. Not for me. Not for anyone." The man lowered his head, finally allowing himself to feel the enormity of what was happening, his body shaking with relief, disbelief, and something that resembled hope for the first time in years. For a fleeting moment, the past and present collided in the heat of Memphis. Every insult, every act of cruelty, every moment of fear that had once defined their relationship now seemed suspended, replaced by an electric possibility. That one encounter, one decision, could begin to rewrite a lifetime of pain. The man whispered, voice barely audible, I don't deserve this, but thank you. I don't know how to." His words trailed off, swallowed by the enormity of Elvis's calm, commanding presence. Elvis only smiled faintly, the kind of smile that held empathy, understanding, and unspoken resolve. "You don't need to know how," he said. "Just take the first step. That's all that matters." And in that shared silence, amidst the distant hum of Memphis streets, the impossibility of forgiveness became tangible, palpable, alive. For the first time in decades, the man who had once caused pain felt something he had never thought he would. The fragile, radiant hope that he could be welcomed back into life, into kindness, into possibility. The tension between them lingered like the heavy Memphis humidity, thick and unyielding. Elvis's hand remained gently on the man's shoulder, a silent anchor in a world that had once been chaotic and cruel. The street around them buzzed faintly with life, vendors calling, cars rattling down uneven pavement, but it felt almost inconsequential, as if the universe itself had slowed, allowing this moment to exist in isolation. The man swallowed hard, his voice quivering like a fragile thread stretching to its breaking point. "Elvis, there's something I have to tell you, something I've carried my entire life." He paused, trembling, eyes darting away from the intense calm of Elvis's gaze. He tugged at the frayed sleeves of his coat, his fingers knotted like the twisted regrets he had carried for decades. I ruined lives. Not just yours. He stopped abruptly, ashamed even to continue, his chest rising and falling rapidly with the weight of unspoken guilt. Elvis waited, his breathing steady, eyes soft but attentive. The man's confession began to spill out like water breaking through a dam. He spoke of lost jobs, failed relationships, the slow decay of family bonds that he had once taken for granted. His voice cracked with every admission. "I was cruel, selfish, and I've spent every day knowing that the harm I caused didn't just disappear. I've haunted myself over it, haunted everyone I hurt. Your face, your songs, they were a reminder of everything I'd done wrong." The vulnerability in his voice was raw, unpolished, unlike the confident facade he had once worn in school. And then came the moment that truly staggered Elvis. I listened to your music, always in secret. I never told anyone, because I was ashamed. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when the house was quiet and the world wasn't watching, I'd play your songs, over and over. And they gave me courage, strength I didn't think I deserved. You saved me, even though I hated you for it. The words hung in the air, a jarring mixture of guilt and admiration, shame and reverence. Elvis's mind raced, not with anger, but with the intricate understanding of how life had twisted them both. The man who had once wielded cruelty like a weapon was now a shadow of his former self, trembling under the enormity of the confession. And yet, in those words, there was a hint of redemption, fragile and trembling, like a candle flickering in a storm. I was terrified," the man continued, voice cracking further. "Terrified that if you ever knew the truth, you'd be just like me, that you'd become cruel, hardened, and resentful. And now, standing here, I realize I don't want that. I don't want to carry the pain any longer. I deserve your anger, maybe even your hate. But I can't live without telling you this. I can't keep pretending I was innocent when I was everything else." Elvis's eyes glistened, reflecting the deep empathy that had been forged from years of struggle, fame, and understanding the fragility of the human heart. He thought of his own past, the ridicule, the loneliness, the nights he had felt invisible and powerless, and yet had persisted through music, through hope, through an unwavering belief in something greater than the cruelty of others. He realized in that moment that the boy who had once tormented him was not beyond salvation. He was simply human, like all of them, stumbling through life, desperate for absolution. "You've carried this burden far too long," Elvis said softly, voice unwavering but filled with warmth. "The real punishment, it's not mine to give. You've been living it your whole life. That weight, it's been yours to bear. But confessing it, owning it, that's the first step. That's courage." His hand squeezed the man's shoulder lightly, grounding him, offering a lifeline without judgment. The man's face crumpled, tears streaming freely now, mixing with the dust and sweat of a long, difficult life. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," he whispered, barely audible. "But I did. I did every day. And the worst part is that your music, your voice, it was my only light, and I was too blind to see it at the time." Elvis studied him, seeing every nuance, the trembling lips, the reddened eyes, the slumped shoulders, and he understood fully. This was the man stripped of all pretense, of all bravado, exposed in the most vulnerable way imaginable. And yet, instead of rage, he felt a profound sense of connection, the kind born from shared understanding of life's harsh lessons. He recognized the opportunity before him, the chance to transform not just the man's guilt, but perhaps even his own understanding of forgiveness and humanity. "You were afraid," Elvis said, voice steady but compassionate, "that the world might change me into something cruel. But standing here, listening to you, I see that fear was yours to face, and you've finally done it. You've faced yourself. That takes strength, more than most people ever find in a lifetime." The man sank to his knees, overcome by the depth of his own remorse, the weight of decades of regret finally breaking him open. Elvis knelt slightly beside him, not as a celebrity, not as the king of rock and roll, but as a fellow human being who had understood the sting of cruelty and the resilience of spirit. I don't know how to make this right," the man choked out. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. Not really." "You don't have to know how," Elvis replied gently. "All you have to do is start. Start living differently. Start giving yourself a chance." For a long moment, the sounds of the city faded into the background. The heat, the distant traffic, the whispers of onlookers, all of it receded, leaving only two men, bound by a past of pain, yet standing on the edge of something fragile and transformative, the possibility of redemption. And in that quiet, in that suspended Memphis street, the unlikeliest of truths began to take root. That even the deepest wounds, inflicted by the most thoughtless hands, could be met with grace, and perhaps, one day, healed. The soft rumble of the Cadillac's engine felt like a heartbeat in the thick Memphis night, steady and deliberate, as Elvis guided the car onto the familiar stretch of highway that led to Graceland. The city lights shimmered faintly in the rearview mirror, flickering over the polished chrome of the car's dashboard, but inside, the world felt suspended, as if the universe had shrunk to the two men and the hum of the engine. The man, slumped in the passenger seat, barely dared breathe, his eyes fixed on the worn leather, on the shimmering reflection of neon signs sliding past the windows. He kept repeating one thought in his head. Why? Why is he doing this? Why me? He had imagined this moment countless times over the years, not with the warmth and understanding he was now receiving, but with fear, dread, and punishment. He had expected ridicule, maybe even violence, or at the very least, the icy glare of contempt. And yet here he was, being driven, quietly, purposefully, to the home of the man he had tormented, by the man he had once thought of as weak and harmless. Elvis's gloved hand rested lightly on the steering wheel, the other on the door. His posture was relaxed, yet there was an undeniable strength in the way he held himself. His mind wandered briefly, not in thoughts of fame or fortune, not in memories of sold-out shows or screaming crowds, but to the boy he once was, the one hiding behind oversized shoes and a hesitant smile, the one who had first felt the sting of mockery. And in that recollection, he saw the other man in a new light, not as the bully who had struck him, but as a human being, damaged by life's circumstances, desperate for a lifeline. I don't understand why you're doing this," the man finally whispered, voice trembling as much from disbelief as from the weight of the confession still lodged in his chest. His fingers fidgeted with the tattered cuffs of his coat, a nervous tic that had accompanied him since childhood. "Why? Why are you letting me in?" Elvis cast a sidelong glance at him, eyes glimmering with a quiet intensity. "Because I remember what it's like to be invisible, to be crushed under the weight of someone else's cruelty. And I also remember what it felt like to have a single person, a single moment, change my life. I'm giving you that chance now." The man turned his gaze toward him, stunned, speechless, his mind scrambling to reconcile the image of the legendary king of rock and roll, the man whose songs had echoed across the nation, whose name alone could make hearts race, with the figure beside him, calm, compassionate, and unflinchingly human. This is impossible. He shouldn't be doing this. No one would ever do this. As the Cadillac rolled through the familiar wrought-iron gates of Graceland, the man's jaw tightened. He recognized the mansion from magazine photographs and television specials, but seeing it in person, alive with the glow of lamplight spilling onto the driveway, was overwhelming. The sprawling estate, usually a symbol of opulence and untouchable celebrity, suddenly felt intimate, almost vulnerable, reflecting the extraordinary generosity of the man at the wheel. Elvis parked near the porte-cochere, the tires crunching softly on the gravel. The man exhaled, an involuntary sound, as if he had been holding his breath for decades, waiting for punishment that never came. He glanced at the grounds, the meticulously kept gardens, the familiar white pillars that had symbolized fame and distance, and now seemed to symbolize possibility, transformation, and forgiveness. You could have just walked away," the man murmured, voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't have to invite me here." Elvis turned, gaze steady, a faint, knowing smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I didn't have to," he admitted softly. "But I did. Because sometimes doing the right thing isn't about what people expect you to do. It's about what the moment demands. And this moment, it demands mercy." The man's mind reeled. He felt unworthy, an imposter in the very house of the person he had once tormented. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding Elvis's eyes. And yet, with every beat of his heart, he sensed the sincerity in every word, the authenticity of a man who had achieved more than fame. He had mastered the rarest art of all, grace. Inside the Cadillac, the air was thick with unspoken emotions, guilt, shame, awe, and a fragile thread of hope. The man dared to glance at Elvis again, and in that gaze he saw something that had eluded him for decades: acceptance. Not forced, not hollow, but genuine, radiating from a man who had once known fear and ridicule and had emerged unbroken, willing to extend a hand to someone who had once caused him pain. The moment the gates closed behind them, the man felt the world shift slightly. The streets of Memphis, the distant honking cars, the whisper of night winds, all seemed to fade. There was no stage, no audience, no fanfare, only this small, impossible bubble where two lives, once intertwined by cruelty and suffering, could now find reconciliation. Elvis's voice cut gently through the silence, almost a lull in the night. "You're here now. You don't have to be the man you were. You can be better. Starting today." For the first time in decades, the man felt a glimmer of something unfamiliar yet profound. Possibility. Not just survival, not just existence, but the fragile, thrilling notion that life could be reshaped, even for him, even now. And as the Cadillac glided toward the house, he realized that the world he had feared, mockery, rejection, judgment, had been replaced, in this miraculous moment, by something unimaginable: hope. Outside, the fans lingering near the perimeter of Graceland caught sight of the car. Whispers rippled through the crowd, curiosity sparking in every corner, but the man barely noticed. His attention was fixed entirely on the figure beside him, the man who had turned the unthinkable into reality, the king who had chosen not only to forgive, but to elevate, to offer redemption where none had existed. And as the massive white columns of Graceland loomed before them, bathed in golden light, the man felt the weight of his life's regrets lift, ever so slightly, replaced by the incredible, almost blinding light of second chances. The front doors of Graceland opened, revealing the soft golden glow of the grand hallway, the air thick with the faint scent of polished wood and floral arrangements. The man hesitated on the threshold, one hand gripping the edge of his coat, as if to steady himself against the impossibility of what had just happened. He could hear the quiet shuffle of footsteps from the staff, the subtle clink of dishes being arranged in anticipation of dinner, and the low hum of Elvis's voice, calm and guiding, telling him to step inside. Every step felt surreal. The polished floors reflected the lights above, giving the impression that the house was glowing from within. Portraits of family and past performances adorned the walls, silent witnesses to decades of music, fame, and triumph. But tonight, they would witness something even more extraordinary, an act of human grace unfolding quietly in the opulence of a home that had known both adulation and solitude. Elvis led him past the grand staircase, his hand resting lightly on the man's shoulder. Not in dominance, but in assurance, a steadying presence that reminded him that he was safe here, despite all the ghosts of his past. The staff watched from a distance, whispers barely audible, their expressions a mixture of awe, confusion, and cautious admiration. They had heard the stories of Elvis's generosity, but nothing could have prepared them for the sight of their employer inviting a man, ragged and hesitant, into his home, treating him with dignity rather than disdain. They entered the dining room, where a long table gleamed under the soft chandelier light. Crystal glasses caught the illumination, scattering tiny rainbows across the polished surface, and the silverware shone with meticulous care. The table was set for a royal gathering, yet the scene tonight carried an emotional gravity far beyond any opulence or luxury. Elvis gestured for the man to sit in the chair of honor at the head of the table, a place that usually held him as host, a king among admirers. Now, the chair symbolized something different, a seat of reconciliation, an invitation to step into a life that had seemed forever out of reach. The man sat, hands trembling slightly as he ran his fingers over the smooth wood. He felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the surreal juxtaposition of his former cruelty and current vulnerability, the enormity of the forgiveness being extended to him. He glanced at Elvis, whose calm demeanor and serene expression offered no judgment, only understanding, and he felt the sting of tears threatening to spill. Elvis broke the silence, his voice low and commanding enough to carry meaning without force. "I wanted you to see this," he said, gesturing at the carefully arranged spread before them. Platters of roasted meats, fresh vegetables, and golden bread shimmered under the chandelier, but the gesture was far more than hospitality. It was symbolism. Every dish was an unspoken declaration. Here, you are a guest, not an outcast. Here, your past does not define you. The man's throat tightened. He had lived decades thinking of himself as irredeemable, punished by life for his past misdeeds. And yet here he was, seated across from the person he had tormented, treated not with contempt, but with dignity. He wanted to speak, to explain, to apologize, but words faltered on his tongue, weak against the torrent of emotion inside him. Elvis's voice cut through the tension once more. "Do you remember the day you broke my guitar?" The question was calm, even, almost casual, but its weight was undeniable. The man flinched, a shudder running through him as memories long suppressed surged forward. The sneer, the snap of strings, the laughter of classmates echoing in his ears. He felt exposed, as if every fault he had ever committed were laid bare in the golden light of Graceland. Tears filled his eyes, unbidden and unstoppable. I remember, he stammered, voice cracking under the weight of decades of regret. It was the worst thing I ever did. I've hated myself for it every day since. Elvis nodded slowly, his gaze steady and unflinching. I know, he said simply, yet each word carried immense power. And I forgive you. That day is in the past. But what matters now is what you do from here. The room seemed to breathe with the gravity of his words. The staff, still watching from the corners, felt a collective intake of breath, sensing that they were witnessing a moment that transcended simple hospitality, a moment where human kindness and moral courage intertwined in a way that would be remembered long after the plates were cleared. The man's shoulders shook with quiet sobs, the weight of decades lifting ever so slightly as he allowed himself to feel relief, gratitude, and shame simultaneously. He had come to Graceland expecting nothing, bracing for condemnation, and yet he had received the unthinkable, a chance at restoration, offered freely by the man whose life he had once sought to diminish. Elvis continued, speaking softly, almost conversationally, yet each phrase resonated with moral clarity. You don't have to carry your mistakes alone anymore. You have a choice. You can either let them define you, or you can choose to be better. And I'm giving you the chance to make that choice. For a long moment, the man simply nodded, unable to speak, each second stretching into an eternity as he absorbed the enormity of what had just occurred. The opulent dining room, with its polished surfaces and sparkling light, had become a sanctuary, a stage for transformation that no music could replicate. In that silence, the man understood something he had never allowed himself to hope for. He could be redeemed, and this redemption had been offered not in judgment, but in grace. And as the two men sat together, the man's gaze finally lifting to meet Elvis's, he saw something he had never expected to witness in his lifetime. The profound, unwavering strength of compassion. It was not loud, it was not flashy, but it was far more powerful than the roar of any audience, the flash of any camera, or the accolades of a world that had once celebrated his tormentor. In that moment, the man realized that the true power of the king was not in his fame, his voice, or his wealth. It was in his capacity to forgive and to offer a path forward, even to those who had once caused him pain. The arena lights blazed like a second sun as the night settled over Memphis. Outside, a restless crowd murmured, the air thick with anticipation, but inside, the tension was almost tangible. Backstage, the man who had once tormented a shy boy in a small school now sat silently in the shadows, clutching a program, his knuckles white. The roar of fans crescendoed through the walls, vibrating under his feet, reminding him that he was about to step into a world he had never imagined he would belong to. Elvis appeared, a figure at once familiar and majestic, stepping into the spotlight behind the curtain. His presence commanded attention, even in the vastness of the arena. The man watched him, heart hammering, every muscle tense. He had rehearsed nothing. He had expected nothing. Yet here he was, about to face not only the man who had once been his victim, but thousands of witnesses, thousands of eyes that would dissect every nuance, every twitch of emotion. The crowd's chant swelled as the first notes of the band filled the arena, a familiar rhythm that rippled through the souls of everyone present. Elvis moved with the confidence of a man who had long since mastered the stage. Yet there was something different tonight. A quiet intensity in his gaze, a deliberate, measured energy that suggested something profound was about to unfold. Then, without warning, Elvis's voice cut through the music. Not in song, but in speech, deliberate and clear, carrying the weight of decades. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his eyes sweeping the audience with that magnetic pull he had wielded for years. "Tonight, I want to share a story with you. A story from my childhood. A story about a boy who faced ridicule, who was tormented, and about a man who once caused that pain." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Whispers turned to murmurs. Everyone leaned forward in their seats, the arena falling into a strange, expectant silence. The man in the shadows shifted, uncertain whether to brace for humiliation or relief, heart hammering against his ribs. He had anticipated shame, but not this. The vulnerability of being seen, not as an audience to be feared, but as someone offered grace. Elvis's voice softened, almost a whisper, yet it reached the farthest corners of the arena. That boy grew up, endured, and found his voice. But he never forgot. And the man who caused him pain, well, he is here tonight. And I want the world to know. The pause was deliberate, each second stretching in the charged air. I forgive him. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to still. The lights dimmed slightly, casting the man in a soft glow. He could barely breathe, trembling under the collective gaze of thousands. Tears welled in his eyes, blurring the harsh lights, the rows of expectant faces, the camera flashes that punctuated the silence like fireflies. He sank to his knees, overcome by the weight of what was being offered. Grace, not punishment. Mercy, not scorn. The audience didn't move. The moment stretched, pregnant with emotion. Then, almost imperceptibly, a wave of understanding swept through the arena. A murmur became a rising tide, and finally, the crowd erupted. Not in derision, not in mockery, but in awe, in admiration, in shared humanity. Hands clapped, voices cheered, tears shone in countless eyes. The applause was thunderous, not just for the man on stage, but for the act itself, for the courage to transform pain into forgiveness, cruelty into compassion. Backstage, the man raised his head slowly, still on his knees. He glimpsed the vast sea of faces, each one a witness to his redemption. His gaze met Elvis's, and for the first time in decades, he saw no anger, no resentment, only understanding, patience, and the quiet power of someone who had survived his own suffering and emerged capable of extraordinary generosity. Elvis stepped closer, his hand reaching out. The man hesitated for an instant, unsure if he deserved it, then allowed himself to be lifted from the floor. The crowd roared, their energy washing over them like a tidal wave. Yet, in that intimate connection, only the two men existed, the tormentor and the forgiven, linked in a moment of unparalleled human truth. The man's voice broke through the thrum of the arena, raw and shaky. I don't deserve this," he whispered, barely audible. Yet every word trembled with sincerity, with decades of regret finally released. "You do," Elvis said simply, the calm authority of his tone carrying the weight of justice and mercy intertwined. "We all deserve a chance to be better. And this is yours." The moment became legend in real time. Phones captured it, cameras recorded it, and somewhere deep in the audience, a collective understanding took root. Strength is not in retaliation, nor is it in enduring suffering silently. True strength lies in the courage to forgive. and the bravery to receive forgiveness. As the music swelled once more, Elvis led the man forward, hand in hand, into the center of the stage. For the first time, the man saw not just the thousands of eyes, but the countless hearts that had witnessed his redemption. And as the spotlight illuminated him, he understood that this public test, this moment of exposure, had not humiliated him. It had liberated him, offering a new life in the light of forgiveness. The audience rose to their feet, applause so loud it seemed the walls themselves would shatter, and the man allowed himself to cry openly, unashamed. In that singular electric moment, decades of guilt, fear, and isolation were washed away, replaced by hope, gratitude, and a fragile but undeniable sense of rebirth. And through it all, Elvis stood beside him, not as judge, not as king, but as a man who understood the deepest truths of the human heart, that compassion is stronger than hatred, forgiveness more powerful than punishment, and that every soul, no matter how lost, can find its way home. The arena had emptied, but the echo of the night lingered like a heartbeat in Memphis. Outside, fans still lingered, reluctant to leave the memory of what they had witnessed, the unprecedented, astonishing act of grace. Inside, under the dim glow of the backstage lights, the man who had once been a tormentor sat quietly, overwhelmed by a tide of emotion he had not known he could feel. For decades, guilt had been his constant companion, gnawing at his pride and poisoning every small joy. Tonight, that burden had been lifted, not by a court, not by punishment, but by a man whose strength lay in his capacity to forgive. Elvis watched him closely, a mixture of warmth and expectation in his gaze. The crowd's roar still lingered like a distant storm, but here, in this intimate space, the silence was a sanctuary. "You know," Elvis began softly, "forgiveness is not just an act for the other person. It's a gift you give yourself, too." The man swallowed hard, tears streaking his face, nodding, barely able to speak. I think I understand," he whispered. Without another word, Elvis guided him through the quiet halls of Graceland, each step deliberate, heavy with symbolism. The house was serene now, a contrast to the chaos outside. Portraits of Elvis as a child, young man, and performer lined the walls, each image a reminder of the journey from struggle to triumph. As they passed, the man's eyes were drawn to the photographs of young Elvis, fragile yet resolute. He felt an almost unbearable recognition. The boy in the pictures could have been him, the one who had faltered and fallen, ridiculed for his choices, misunderstood and alone. They entered the private dining room, a space transformed for the occasion. A table had been quietly set with care, the finest dishes laid out with precision. Elvis gestured toward a chair. "Sit," he said simply. The man hesitated, then obeyed, still unsure if he deserved the courtesy, the care, the gesture of inclusion. But there was no hesitation in Elvis's eyes, no doubt. Only certainty, a calm authority that came from decades of understanding human frailty and triumph. Over dinner, the conversation was cautious at first. Small talk, tentative questions, words measured like steps across fragile ice. Yet gradually, the barrier of fear and shame began to crumble. Elvis asked about the man's life, not with judgment, but with curiosity and empathy. And slowly, the man began to open, recounting the hardships, the mistakes, the long years of regret that had haunted him. Then came the moment that would define the evening. Elvis leaned forward, voice calm but firm. "Do you remember that day?" The man's stomach clenched, a lump rising in his throat. "The guitar," Elvis continued. "When you broke my guitar in school?" The man bowed his head, sobbing uncontrollably, the decades of shame pouring out. "It was the worst thing I ever did," he choked out. "I thought I could forget it. I thought if I ignored it, it would disappear. But it never did. It stayed with me every day." Elvis reached across the table, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "I never forgot either," he said. "But life doesn't have to be about revenge or guilt. It can be about what you do with what you've learned, about the choices you make now." The man nodded, tears soaking the napkin in his hands. I want to be better," he admitted. "I want a second chance." Elvis smiled, not in condescension, but with the quiet power of someone who had lived through suffering and come to understand that redemption is possible. "Then you shall have it," he said. "You'll work here, with me. There's more to life than the past. Let's start your new chapter." The next morning, the story had spread like wildfire. Newspapers across the country carried the headline, "Elvis forgives his childhood tormentor." Fans called radio stations, television crews returned to the scene, and the story became a beacon of hope, a tangible example of how one act of mercy could ripple outward, touching countless lives. The man arrived at Graceland that day to begin his new work, a simple job at first, maintenance, tending gardens, small tasks, but each step was infused with purpose. For the first time in years, he felt pride without shame, hope without fear. He worked diligently, often pausing to glance at Elvis in admiration and gratitude. There were mistakes along the way, moments of doubt and insecurity, yet every challenge was met with guidance, patience, and encouragement. Elvis never patronized him. He never reminded him of the past unnecessarily. Instead, he offered mentorship through example, discipline, kindness, patience, and unwavering moral clarity. And slowly, the man began to see himself not as a failed bully, not as a shadow of his younger cruelty, but as a human capable of redemption, of kindness, of meaningful contribution. Months passed. Word of the story spread even further, reaching those who had known the man in his darker days. Friends and family, initially skeptical, witnessed the transformation. Children once estranged returned, cautiously at first, but then fully, drawn by the authenticity of the change. And all the while, the man remembered the night in the arena when forgiveness had been offered not as charity, but as a sacred act of trust and belief in human potential. In quiet moments, he reflected on the truth he had come to understand. The strength of a person is not measured by their ability to punish or dominate, but by their ability to love, to forgive, and to rebuild. And there, in the heart of Graceland, surrounded by reminders of a boy who had once faced humiliation and a man who had once inflicted it, he found the courage to embrace his own humanity fully, without reservation. Elvis, observing from a distance, knew that this was the culmination not only of the man's journey, but of his own lifelong understanding of power and grace. He understood that fame and talent were fleeting. The true legacy of a life well lived lay in the ability to heal, to transform pain into purpose, and to extend compassion when it was least expected, but most needed. And so, the man who had once haunted a shy child's school days now stood with dignity, hope glimmering in his eyes for the first time in decades. He had been given a chance at redemption, a chance to rebuild, and he seized it with trembling hands, but a resolute heart. The audience of fans, the world that had watched from afar, and the countless lives touched by this story understood the ultimate truth. Real power is not in celebrity, wealth, or recognition. Real power is in the courage to forgive, to rebuild, and to love beyond measure. In that, Elvis had triumphed, not just as a performer, not just as a legend, but as a man whose true gift to the world was the extraordinary capacity to restore hope, to shine light into the darkest corners, and to remind humanity that it is never too late to start anew.